Alright, so first step is obviously you gotta get your pattern. So I have my pattern right here, all cut out, taped together, ready to go. So you can purchase this in my store. I will link that down below. And then I use Adobe Acrobat to print out my patterns because these obviously span over multiple pages. It is a free program, and then to print it out you just go to the print settings and select poster and then print it out and tape it all together. And then cut out your pattern and transfer it to your foam. So here is the foam that I use. It is 1/2 inch project foam that I get from Walmart. It's about $10 a roll, and one roll is plenty for one headpiece. It is plenty for a Rebels headpiece, so it's plenty for any other headpiece. You can also get this stuff at Joann's, I believe, but I get it from Walmart just because generally Walmart's a little bit cheaper, and also Walmart's a little bit closer for me to go to. So then you're gonna go ahead and trace out your pattern onto the foam. I would recommend using a lighter color marker for doing this. I used magenta simply because I can't find the light blue I normally use, and I just use a regular Sharpie. I have used red before, and red does actually have a tendency to bleed through the fabric and the paint, so you can kind of see it a little bit seeping through. I did talk about that in my season 7 foam headpiece overview video, and you can kind of see the red seeping through. So if you are going to use a darker color or a red marker, put your markings on the inside of it so that you don't have to worry about it seeping through as much. So that's what I will be doing with these ones. And then I personally don't actually put any of my seam lines or registration marks on here just because I know where everything goes. The only thing I do mark is the center line on this top piece because I usually will get it mixed up on what is the seam line for her horn and what is the center of the headpiece. So I do mark that center. Hey guys, just popping in to say that this top piece you can just mirror on that center line instead of cutting it into 2 pieces, because it is basically just cut in half down a straight line down the middle. So if you want, you can just mirror this and make this top piece 1 piece instead of 2. I make mine 2 pieces really just out of habit more than anything, because all of my other headpieces, this specific piece on the top is actually 2 pieces instead of 1. So whatever you prefer. And then go ahead and cut it out. So you can use just regular scissors to cut it out. I do use fabric scissors just because it is a little bit nicer, but you can use just regular scissors to cut it out. So then I do go in and trim the tips of the montrals and lekku. So right here and here, just to remove a little bit of that material. Makes it a little bit easier to sew and kind of makes it sit a little bit nicer and come to that point a little bit nicer. Just cut a little wedge off like that. So then it kind of tapers it. It's hard to see, but it tapers it to that corner. And then I do the other side just like that, and this is on the inside of the piece, so this will be on the inside of the headpiece. And then when I am sewing mine together, I generally like to put it together in chunks. So I will put like the left lekku together, then the right lekku, and then the back lekku, and then sew them all together. I find that that's the easiest just because of like the center seams and everything, but you can sew it together however you want. So I've already started sewing together this one. This is the left lekku. So I just sewed this big seam going down the side, and now I am sewing this inner piece in. So I do pin it with some pins. Hey guys, just popping in to talk about one of the biggest problems I see people having is with their lekku twisting, and generally that's because you're pulling one seam tighter than the other. And the way I put my lekku together is I will sew that long side seam first, and then when I put the inner piece in, I will pin both sides of it, usually starting at the back and then going down to the tip, and then just kind of laying the front seam wherever it wants to sit, and then that will hopefully help prevent any twisting, because you can see while it's pinned before you start sewing if it is twisting and if you need to make any adjustments. So hopefully that helps if you've been having that issue. And now I'm going to sew it together. So I usually use a lighter color like gray, light blue, things like that, or white. The reason I'm not using white is because all of my white thread is really old. So it has a tendency to kind of like fray and just sometimes snap while I'm sewing. So this is newer thread, so it's a lot nicer to use. And then make sure you put a bigger knot on the end of this. Make sure you put a bigger knot on there. I do have two on here just from trying to make that bigger. Because of how porous the foam is, sometimes the knot will pull out if it's not big enough. So now to start sewing. So for my headpieces, I sew them with a Henson stitch. It's also called a puppet stitch or an invisible stitch. There are, I have put mine together using a whip stitch. And generally I do that for when I'm making headpieces for myself, or I am testing out patterns, just because it goes a little bit faster, but it's not quite as neat, and but it's just not quite as neat. Personally, I do think that the Henson stitch, puppet stitch, invisible stitch looks a little bit better. So now to get started. So I am going to start at the tip down here and go up. So I'm just making sure that's not caught on anything, and then just keep going. So I like to do a couple of stitches and then pull it tight. And you do have to be careful on how tight you pull it, because if you pull it too tight, you can actually pull the foam. And you have to be careful mostly on the tips about doing that. And also you have to be careful not to pull it too tight, because you can then rip through the foam. So I'm just going to take this pin out and keep going. You can see right here I do have my Sharpie lines on the inside. Then just pull that tight. You also have to be careful about sewing to make sure your thread doesn't get caught on anything, because if you pull while it's caught in something, like wrapped around this, or I've had it get caught on my chair a couple of times, it will also rip through the foam, which is annoying. See, it went around, so I just gotta make sure. There we go. And then just pull that tight. And there we go. So there is the tip of the lekku all sewn together. So now I'm just going to keep going. So I get asked So one of the biggest problems I see people having when putting this together is putting together the montrol. And the montrol is these three pieces. So it is the front lekku piece, the back lekku piece, and then the top piece. So the front and back lekku piece go together along this long seam down here, and then the top piece goes along right there and then also right there, so they end up forming a pyramid. So here they are sewn together. So these three pieces do meet at the top right here, and that is how they form the lekku, or that's how they form the montrol. So honestly, the easiest way for me I found to put these together is to sew the front and back lekku pieces together, and then once you have the front and back lekku pieces together, so you sew this seam right here, this long seam, and then once you have that sewn, sew these two seams basically as one. Alright, jumping ahead a little bit here, I have already draped the front two montrols, so I'm going to show you how I drape using the back one. I use a lightweight fabric. This is a lightweight knit, so I pin it in place along the top there just to hold it, and then I am going to wrap it around and lightly pull on it to help get rid of some of those wrinkles, and then I am going to pin it in place and cut off any extra, and then just go back in and refine all of that pinning along the seam, pin it along the edges right there where there isn't any other fabric to pin it to. So after everything's all pinned, I am going through and just doing a running stitch to hold it more securely than the pins, and also so I don't have to worry about the pins falling out. I am using a contrasting thread so that it's easier to see whenever the time comes to take that running stitch out. So once I am done doing that running stitch on all the seams, I'm going to very carefully pull the fabric off of the foam headpiece so that I can then sew it using the sewing machine. So again, doing this very carefully to make sure that I don't pop any stitches and I don't rip the foam or anything, because the foam can be very easy to rip on this step if you aren't being gentle or careful about it. So now it's time to sew it using the sewing machine, and I am using a small zigzag stitch and just following that running stitch that I did earlier. making sure to stretch the fabric as I go because the running stitch can kind of pull on it and cause wrinkles. So I do stretch it as I go just to make sure that I am avoiding wrinkles, and then just keep sewing all of those seams. So once all of those seams have been sewn with the sewing machine, I am going to go in and very carefully trim off all this extra fabric, trying to get as close as I can to the stitching. I do leave about 1mm of seam allowance there, and just go in and carefully trim up all of that seam allowance. And now I am going to remove that running stitch that I put in earlier. I'm just going to find a loose thread or a loose stitch and just pull on it and cut it and pull out as much of that thread. So this is why I use a contrasting thread for this, so it's a lot easier to see against the white stitching of the machine and the white fabric. And again, since it is temporary, it's just a lot easier to use a contrasting thread. So once all of those seams are trimmed up and that running stitch is all removed, it's time to turn it right side out and put it back on the foam form. Again, being very careful here so that you don't rip your fabric, you don't pop any stitches, and you don't rip the foam or pop any stitches on the foam, because again, this step, it can be very easy to accidentally rip the foam or pop a couple of stitches on the foam form of this. So just starting at the tips and just working it up like a sock, basically. And then once I have it all the way on, I will do some adjusting, pulling and tugging, and just rearranging the fabric so that it sits how it should. And I'm happy with it. So here's the paint that I use for my headpieces. It is Plaid Effects in Snow White and Commander Navy. And then I do use a fabric medium. So this is Kerma Coat by Delta Creative. So all of these I was able to find at Hobby Lobby, but recently I have not been able to find the Commander Navy anywhere in stores, so I did have to order this online. But the white paint and the textile medium you can find at Hobby Lobby or online. And then what I do is I mix these in about a 1-to-1 ratio, and then I do add a little bit of water in there. So like I'll put enough paint and fabric medium to fill up to like here, and then fill it up the rest of the way with water. I only water down the white. The blue, I only put the fabric medium in, but for the blue, even just adding the textile medium does water it down a little bit, so you do have to do a couple of coats. And then I have special bottles. I have designated bottles for ones that have the fabric medium mixed in. So these 3 bottles that have the labels ripped off are ones that have fabric medium in them. And the reason I rip the labels off is so it's a very easy way to see clearly that these ones are different, instead of just writing on there and then the writing getting lost or something. For the white, I just use a 1-inch wide flat brush. I find that using something smaller just takes too long, and using anything bigger is hard to get in the bottle to get the paint out because these are pretty small bottles. And then for the blue, I do use some finer paint brushes. I use a smaller flat brush, about I think 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, and then I use a pointed brush for the edges. So here is the headband. It is just made from a couple different layers of craft foam. So I'm going to glue these together. I'm going to heat seal and heat shape them, and then plasti dip and paint them before I finally attach them to the headpiece. So the way I made this pattern is I actually just cut out a piece of paper in this rough shape, and then held it up to my forehead and refined the shape until I was happy with it. Alright, so here it is with the white on there. It's hard to tell because this is white fabric with white paint on it. But you can see right here, here is unpainted fabric and here is painted fabric. So it does obviously change the opacity of it and the texture a little bit. So this is still drying, and I can see that I do have a couple of little spots in here. It's hard for the camera to pick it up because these colors are so close, but in real life I can see where the paint's a little bit thin, or if there are spots that I missed. And then I do have a couple of spots right there, right here, that I do need to go in and touch up. I have the headband mostly done. So here's what it looks like. I do need to put a couple more coats of paint on the little lights here, and then it will be ready to glue on. So here are the 2 paintbrushes that I'm going to be using. And then I do have a reference headpiece. So I personally don't draw on any guidelines or anything, just because I've painted so many headpieces, and I do have a headpiece right next to me that I do go directly based off of. You can use either a pencil or something. Some people use like eyeliner or makeup pencils to mark out the lines. But since I do have this reference, I'm not going to do that. So here's where we are right now. It is about halfway done, minus going over and doing the second coat. So you can see right here, I very clearly need to go in and do a second coat to fix that up. Still haven't done the tips just because that's where I hold it. I did go in and do a second coat on this module. So I went and did a second coat on this module so you can see that this one is darker and a bit more opaque, whereas this one has some streaks in it still, so that one looks a whole lot better. And then you can kind of see here on the bottom right here, this little area right here, I did go in and do a second coat already, and then I still have to do a second coat on the rest of it. So as you can see, I've gotten it mostly painted, so here's where it is right now. I've gotten the one module second coated, and then I still have a couple of places, mainly on the inside and the tips, that I still need to go over and paint, and then I have to do the second coat on that side. But for the most part, it is just about all painted and pretty much ready for the second coat. Alright, so the paint job is almost done. I have finished the outside, and I did go in and touch up some of these spots where I got some blue on the white. I am going to go over those with another layer just because of the opacity of the white, and covering any dark color in white takes a couple of layers. And then I still have to finish the inside here, but I'm going to take this off and so that I can work on the back here and glue this down, and then go in and finish painting this. And while I'm gluing that down, I'll glue down these other edges and then glue the headband on. You don't have to glue down the edges of the fabric if you don't want to, depending on how thick your fabric is, because the paint will actually seep through the fabric and kind of glue the fabric to the foam. So it did it right here along this blue stripe, so that's actually kind of glued down with the paint. Yeah, so along these blue areas it did it. It didn't do it as much on the white. It did it a little up here on this seam along here. So you don't have to glue it down. I personally like to glue it down just because I can also use the glue to help kind of flatten this edge a little bit so that it lays a bit smoother and a bit closer to the head. Alright, so here I am gluing down these edges and also trimming off any of that extra fabric. I am just using hot glue. I find that hot glue is the easiest to work with. You can also use contact cement or super glue for this. And then again, just hot gluing that headband on. I personally find hot glue is just the easiest to work with for this. And then just touching up the last bit of paint right there now that I have everything trimmed up. Alright, so here is the headband for her mechanic outfit. So I just made a pattern real quick myself. I just put some masking tape on the headpiece. I did do this after I already put the fabric and the white paint on, and then waited until the white paint dried, and it worked out very nicely. The tape didn't pull up any paint or anything, and then I did stick it to some paper and kind of cleaned up the lines a little bit, and then just traced it to craft foam. So I did do 2 layers of 2mm craft foam because she does have this little layering right here, and it is all just one piece that will be glued to the front and then wrap around underneath her back leg and be glued to the back. I don't have the diamond yet because it is still drying, but then I will also glue the diamond on. I did heat shape this a little bit, but when I painted it, the heat shaping just didn't stay. You can kind of see there is still a little bit of like a dome right here from heat shaping it on the forehead, but yeah, my heat shaping just did not stay. Honestly, I'm not too worried about it because of how flexible this foam is, because it is just 2 layers of 2mm foam. So I'm just going to glue it down and just kind of shape everything as I'm gluing it down. Yeah, if you want, you could make yours out of some faux leather or something, or you could use foam and cover it in fabric instead of painting it. I just personally prefer to paint it because I have covered headbands in fabric before, and the fabric kind of likes to bubble just because then you have to kind of bend and shape the headband. So if you were to do that, I would definitely suggest doing some heat shaping to your headband first, so you don't have to worry so much about rippling or anything with your fabric. You could also just use plain fabric and not put foam underneath it. I personally like the structure that foam gives these headbands and these crowns. Gives them a little bit of structure and shape, especially around the face. But that's just what I prefer to do. So there are a couple of minor differences in these stripes between her mechanic and her siege outfit. So right here, this is a bit straighter, whereas in her siege it kind of curves a little bit. And then right here she has just the one little point right here. In her siege outfit she has the beginning of a second little point right here. And then on the back she only has this one arrow, I guess you could call it. And then in her siege she does have a smaller one underneath it. As you can see, I have also not finished painting this one. I do have to do the second layer of paint for these bottom 2 pieces and then some touching up. So now this headband is all glued on, and I'm just going in and trimming up that fabric and then trimming up any foam that I need to so that it's all nice and neat and clean, and then I'll glue on the diamond and it'll be done. So here are some images of both headpieces complete and ready to go. I hope you guys found this helpful and informative, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below, and I will also link my Etsy shop if you're interested in buying these patterns. I'll see you guys next time. Bye!